We are sharing the discoveries made while exploring the behavior of information in public transit settings. The research for this project was gathered, compiled, and presented by Scott Bahlmann, Caitlin Snow, Catherine Matthews, Sarah Bryan, and Michael MacManus. With researchers in Washington, Utah, and Massachusetts, we selected an information ground easily accessible to all members of our team, which allowed us to compare information across 3 areas of the country. Public transit centers are of particular interest to library and information professionals because participants in this ground come from a variety of social, cultural, and economic backgrounds similar to the public library setting. Most of our data collection occurred in the greater Seattle area, and statistics from Sound Transit are a good representation of the participants we drew from, with the exception that our demographics skewed slightly younger than the average rider, as some of the sites were primarily used by university students. We gathered our data through non-participant observations, 2 observations that included informal interviews, 1 formal interview, and a survey distributed to 2 online library groups with 30 respondents. Observations were primarily conducted in the late morning to early afternoon, with more weekday observations than weekends. Our findings generally support the idea of transit centers displaying hostage phenomena. Transit centers seem to be information grounds that support an individual experience. In the guideline for buskers, Sound Transit states, "Sound Transit light rail stations exist for public transit-related activities and provide limited space for other activities." We'll demonstrate how this hostage situation creates a ground rich in the serendipitous exchange of information by looking at the place, people, and information factors of public transit centers.
Place factors, namely informational signs and physical space, in public transit centers highly influence activity in this information ground. Our non-participant and participant observations demonstrated that these factors resulted in distinct behaviors that hinged on a participant's familiarity with public transit norms. Informational signs were scattered throughout each space, largely text-heavy, and primarily in English on a range of subjects like schedules, codes of conduct, and ads, among others. Due to this saturation, more experienced, solitary participants generally did not engage with signs unless they perceived new information. For example, one survey respondent downloaded a new transit-related app from a notice. In contrast, less experienced, solitary participants favored getting information from strangers, though these conversations typically did not go beyond that transactional exchange. Though physical space varied across locality, we observed commonalities in delineated seating and implied conduct locations that influenced behavior. Due to the seating style, participants generally kept to themselves and used an electronic device even if communal seating was available. In contrast, implied conduct locations resulted in nonverbal, communally agreed upon behaviors regardless of prior transit experience. For example, participants did not cross the yellow line in the track station or engage in loud conversations on buses.
Ford remarks that information behavior may be observed not only at the individual level, but also as people work in interaction with others at the levels of groups, organizations, and communities. We decided to research people in relation to the bus as a social or non-social environment, and how these interactions with others influence patterns in Metro users' information behavior. Our survey results illustrated that very few people actually enjoy speaking with strangers, as only one respondent chose yes to the question, "Do you enjoy chatting with strangers during your transit?" This was the only respondent to have a commute of more than 2 hours. We also found that people take an observational role over an active role in conversations with other Metro users. For example, one survey participant spoke about a person talking about the Seattle rugby team. Instead of addressing this information need directly through conversation, the user turned to their mobile device to uncover they had been talking about the Sounders. During a personal interview with a frequent Metro user, the participant spoke about gravitating towards familiar faces when trying to find a seat in the mornings. He noted he partners up with the same person during his commute to work. There are no spoken interactions between these people, but there is a gesturing at times, like a head nod, for example. He described the occasional nods as becoming somewhat routine. He also spoke about using physical characteristics to identify people, since these connections are informal. For example, he remarks that there's a blonde woman that always presses the 41 stop, and he knows that if she's on the bus, he doesn't have to worry about somebody requesting his stop. There's an unspoken recognition, or the participant describes it as some kind of familiarity through observation that is shared between the riders and himself. He also told a story where two different people started chatting with him on the same day, and how it was an unusual happenstance. He heard stories about a stranger's life, exchanged names, and even gave a recommendation for a backpack that he really liked. He said that nothing like that had happened in years, I feel like, and it felt good, really good. I was kind of buzzing after that.
When examining information factors, we were interested in how participants utilize their time on public transit. Our survey from librarians who are transit users found that 73% of our 30 respondents read, and using an electronic device at 70% was the second most popular option. We inquired further with a series of questions asking how people use their electronic devices. 70% said they use their devices to check social media or networking outlets, with leisure gaming and current events tying for second at 37%. Some reported multitasking on their devices, such as one respondent saying that they checked out books mentioned on podcast. In addition to individual electronic factors used by riders, buses, trains, and the stations themselves also utilize technology to communicate information like routes, times, and announcements, both visually and with audio. One interview participant indicated that they're always checking the time, usually on the little light-up display and the stop requested. While we didn't find coaches offering Wi-Fi in our observations, some stations and platforms like the downtown Seattle Transit Tunnel offer free Wi-Fi for use by riders within the station. Multiple free apps exist to help riders navigate with real-time transit information, and many transit systems provide their own trip planning apps, often advertised within transit centers and coaches. Even though public transportation presents an information ground rich with potential for a broad cross-section of society to interact, we found in our research that information exchanges are often nonverbal, indirect, or serendipitous. Rider rules of conduct across transit systems generally discourage interpersonal interaction to prevent driver distraction and maintain rider satisfaction. Still, riders find indirect ways of communicating with each other. The frequent user said that recognizing another frequent user who uses the same stop allows them to relax about indicating the stop to the driver. Some seating configurations seem to either indirectly encourage rider communication, as with clusters of seats facing each other, or indeed to discourage interactions, as with the higher-backed seats.
The main problem with public transit as an information ground is the collective of unconsciously agreed upon rules that most bus riders observe. From the surveys we conducted and observations we've made, we found that people who take public transit strongly prefer to avoid interpersonal contact with people they don't know. Another issue with public transit as an information ground is that the population that uses the bus or train is by its very definition transient. Even if the environment of public transit encourages riders to stay for longer periods of time, the majority of passengers ride the bus with a purpose or destination in mind. We know that public transit can be used as an incredibly effective and efficient information ground from the work that other cities have done. In St. Louis, the St. Louis County Library System provides metro stations with surplus library books to provide reading material for those unable to go to the library in person. In San Antonio, Bibliotech, the Bexar County's all-digital library, teamed up with the Metropolitan Transit System to provide digital library kiosks to transit stations. Libraries have done astounding work to make public transit a place where information can be disseminated to a previously untapped demographic.